Hi, my name is Joanne Kennedy and I'm a naturopath in Sydney, Australia, and I specialise in methylation and histamine intolerance. In this video, I'm going to talk to you about histamine biochemistry and the enzymes that are involved in making histamine in the body, and importantly, the enzymes that are involved in breaking histamine down in the body. So here we have the Histamine Pathway Planner from Seeking Health Educational Institute. And this pathway shows us how the body makes histamine from histidine, as well as all the enzymes and cofactors that we need to break down histamine. Okay, so all of these round circles are enzymes, and all of these, everything that's green, these nutrients are cofactors. Okay, so we can see here we've got extracellular histamine. Okay, so extracellular is outside the cell. So a lot of this is often found in the gut, and we've got intracellular histamine, which is formed inside cells. So for instance, inside the liver, the bronchi, the spinal cord, and the brain. Okay, so we can see that both extracellular and intracellular histamine is formed from histidine. Okay, so what is histidine? Histidine is an amino acid, okay, and it gets converted into histamine with the use of this Histidine Decarboxylase enzyme, the HDC enzyme, which is vitamin B6 dependent. Now, this is actually a normal part of our biological processes, as we need histamine to respond to tissue injury. So histamine widens the capillaries so that your white blood cells can go in and repair the tissue. It stimulates gastric acid or hydrochloric acid, which you need to break down your food. It actually signals the production of estrogen to support ovulation and progesterone production. And it's a neurotransmitter in the brain, and it's helpful for learning and memory. It also helps release serotonin and dopamine, which are important neurotransmitters for moods. But what happens with histamine intolerance is that there's a combination of an increase in this enzyme functioning, okay, and I'm going to discuss the reasons why this can happen, okay, as well as a reduction in the enzymes that break down histamine, okay, the DAO enzyme and the Histamine-N-Methyl-transferase enzyme. Okay, so the net result of this is going to be high histamine and histamine intolerance. So if we look at all of these things in yellow, this gives us a good starting point to think about all of the environmental factors that are going to stimulate this enzyme and will create a lot of histamine. Okay, so first of all, we've got catecholamines. Now, these are stress hormones, noradrenaline and adrenaline, and this is common. People come to me with histamine symptoms, particularly skin issues, driven by stress and histamine. Okay, so it is a major cause of high histamine stress. Benzene. Now, this is a chemical used to make plastics, synthetic fibers, dyes, detergents, and pesticides. Now, inflammation. This is a big one. And if you've read my book, you know that I discuss inflammation a lot, as inflammation is an immune response whereby histamine is released. And it's released to widen the capillaries so that your immune cells can travel to the site of injury and repair. But when it becomes chronic, this is when it's chronic, it's going to cause a lot of problems with histamine. Okay, so what are some of the main causes of inflammation? Okay, so these are the main things that I see in my clinic, which is dysbiosis, which is an imbalance between good bacteria and bad bacteria. Okay, here we can see that bacteria is an issue. Okay, we've also got SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which is a type of dysbiosis in the small bowel. We've also got Candida or yeast infections. Okay, so these infections are going to cause an immune response and a histamine response. Oxalates, which are tiny little crystals that can build up in the body, they cause a lot of inflammation, tissue damage, and histamine release. And gluten intolerance is another thing that will really cause a lot of inflammation in the body for a lot of people. Okay, so these LPS toxins. So LPS toxins are lipopolysaccharides, and they are actually found as part of the structure of gram-negative bacteria that you can find in the gut. And in fact, Helicobacter pylori is actually gram-negative bacteria, which is part of the reason it can cause a lot of issues with histamine. So these LPS toxins are very inflammatory, okay, and they will release a lot of histamine in the body, okay? So histamine-containing foods. So these are the foods that contain histamine. They develop histamine or bacteria as part of their maturation process, and these foods are things like fermented foods and aged cheeses and cured meats. Okay, so these are a lot of the things that are going to stimulate this HDC enzyme to create more histamine. Okay, so if we look at this pathway further, there are a lot of enzymes here, I understand that, but clinically, what we really need to focus on are the DAO enzyme, the Diamine Oxidase enzyme, and the Histamine-N-Methyl-transferase enzyme here. Okay, so what we need to know is that the DAO enzyme, okay, is found in most organs. It's very plentiful in the gut, especially small intestine. It's also found in the the large intestine. Okay, it's also found in the prostate, the kidneys, and the placenta. Okay, and the DAO enzyme metabolizes the histamine found outside the cell. So this is mainly occurs in the gut, okay, where the DAO enzyme metabolizes histamine ingested from food, as well as the histamine that's getting released from the gut bacteria, from the Dysbiosis, the yeast, the Candida, the SIBO, okay? The other role the DAO enzyme has is it prevents histamine from getting through the lining of the gastrointestinal tract into the bloodstream. And when histamine gets into the bloodstream, it can cause systemic symptoms, such as hives or itchy skin, anxiety, migraines. It can also cause period pain, okay? So over here, we've got the Histamine-N-Methyl-transferase enzyme. This is widely expressed in human tissue, with the greatest expression in the kidneys and the liver, followed by the spleen, colon, prostate, ovary, and the bronchi. It's also in the central nervous system and the brain, okay? So it's important to know that the amount of DAO enzyme in the central nervous system is very low or absent. It's therefore really purely the job of this Histamine-N-Methyl-transferase enzyme to break down histamine in the spinal cord and the brain. Okay, and this is very important to know, as when treating patients with brain histamine symptoms such as vertigo, migraines, anxiety, insomnia, we need to be addressing any potential issues we have with this Histamine-N-Methyl-transferase enzyme as well as the DAO enzyme. Okay, so you need to be looking at both of those enzymes. Okay, so what are some of the things that can reduce DAO enzyme activity? Okay, so SIBO is a really, really big problem as it reduces DAO enzyme activity. Okay, so with SIBO, there's an overgrowth of bad bacteria in the small intestine, and these bacteria produce gases. And the gases cause inflammation that damage the cells of the gut wall and the microvilli. So the microvilli are tiny little hairs that reside in the gut that store enzymes, including the DAO enzyme. Okay, and the same thing can happen in the large bowel if you have inflammation, dysbiosis, inflammation in the large bowel. Okay, now celiac disease. This will also cause a flattening of the microvilli and therefore a reduction in DAO enzyme. And research also shows that people with Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis have significantly less DAO enzyme activity in the gut compared to healthy individuals. Okay, and this again is all due to the inflammation that occurs in these inflammatory bowel diseases. So the other thing we also need to remember is that when it comes to histamine, the DAO enzyme can simply become overloaded with histamine. Okay, so if you're shunting all this histidine to make histamine due to all these issues, the DAO enzyme is simply going to get overloaded with histamine, and it simply can't cope with all the histamine that you have, and it can't break it all down. This can often happen just by eating a lot of fermented foods. I see that a lot clinically where people will eat a lot of fermented foods. They think it's going to heal their gut, but they break out in hives or have terrible migraines and they don't know why. It's basically because the DAO enzyme is completely overloaded with histamine. Okay, I want to talk about cofactors because many practitioners talk about these cofactors for DAO, copper and calcium. And I can tell you I've never, ever seen one patient that has supplemented with copper and calcium and it's provided them with relief from their histamine issues because it's supporting DAO enzyme, okay? So effectively, we need to understand what is really overloading the DAO enzyme with histamine, which is going to be bacteria from SIBO, Candida, yeast infections, gluten intolerance as well will do that, okay? So just taking these cofactors really doesn't provide you with much benefit. And what we also really need to understand, and this is true for many women, is if they have high histamine, then they're likely to have high estrogen. And estrogen increases copper, which is not a good thing as copper and zinc compete for absorption in the body. So if copper is high, you can become deficient in zinc and you need zinc to make hydrochloric acid. And without hydrochloric acid, you can develop SIBO. And this is a major cause of this histamine issue in the first place. Okay, so supplementing with copper is actually not a good idea for most people when it comes to histamine intolerance. So the Histamine-N-Methyl-transferase enzyme, so as the name suggests, it's a methyltransferase enzyme and it needs a methyl group to function. So if you'd like to know more about how your body makes these methyl groups, you should check out my video on methylation. But essentially what happens is the inflammation from all the gut issues that people with histamine intolerance are presenting with will have absorption issues of the important nutrients we need to make these methyl groups, including folate, vitamin B12, and the amino acid methionine. Okay, now furthermore, the inflammation can cause a reduction in homocysteine, which you also need to make these methyl groups. Okay, so histamine methyltransferase, when you're thinking about histamine in the brain, particularly, you need to be looking at methylation. So I urge you to check out my video on methylation. So where do we start? Okay, it can be really, really overwhelming, but what we have to start to consider is we need to consider with each patient, what are all the things that are stimulating this HDC enzyme to release more histamine? Okay, at the same time, we need to look at what is reducing the DAO enzyme activity. Okay, so we need to look at fixing gut issues, okay, and then we need to look at supporting methylation. Okay, and methylation and gut issues are very, very intricately linked. Okay, you cannot support methylation without fixing gut issues. Long term, as you're not going to be absorbing the nutrients you need for methylation. And if you've got chronic gut issues, it's going to be causing a lot of inflammation, and that will also hinder these methylation pathways.